So what it is in a training environment, there's skill acquisition and then there's skill application, right? And so when you're trying to acquire a new skill, you're more so like a zoo tiger that's taken care of, that's you feed the zoo tiger, they're safe, there's not a lot of struggle versus a jungle tiger who now the environment has changed and they have to utilize their skills for survival. So it's a lot more productive struggle. It's not as safe of a space. But also, if they're trained correctly, they're able to
Hey,
grow
Math Moment
through that
Makers.
struggle.
Today we speak
so
with
it's two
Tom
different
Marker, a 14-year veteran, 6th grade teacher from Ohio. Tom reached out to us to tackle the big struggle of trying to convince his students to avoid rushing to the standard algorithm and instead value strategies that can be more meaningful for use outside of the math classroom.
This is another Math Mentoring Moment episode where we talk with a member of the Math Moment Maker community, a person just like you, who is working through struggles, and together we brainstorm possible next steps and strategies to overcome them. Kyle, are you ready for this one?
Let's do it! Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr. We are from MakeMathMoments.com, and we are two math teachers who together,
with you, the community of math moment makers worldwide who want to build and deliver problem-based math lessons that spark curiosity,
fuel sense-making,
and ignite your teacher moves. Welcome, everyone, to another Math Mentoring Moment episode. These are some of our favorites, and tonight we get to talk to a veteran teacher who's got a challenge that I think we can all relate to.
Before we get into this episode, we chat with Tom and specifically talk about the concept holding your students back, which is a course we have on our learning platform. And registration for that course opens in September of 2021. But we wanted to just mention it here with you right now because Module 1 is completely wide open for you to dive into. And this course, we spent a lot of time, almost a full year building this course because the concept holding our students back is proportional reasoning, right, Kyle?
Absolutely. It's sort of like a passion of ours because it's something that really holds most students back. Like a lot of students actually fall off the math wagon when they get stuck in this additive thinking stage and they can't seem to break into that multiplicative stage. And trust me, we've been there. We've had students stuck, but the problem was we didn't know what was really wrong. We just thought it was math facts, like they just knew their math facts, everything would be okay. And in reality, there's so much more to the story. And we unpack it in this 9-module workshop and course online. You can go check it out at makemathmoments.com/proportions. As John said, the first module is wide open for you to explore. And you can also add yourself to the waiting list if you're interested. If you're from a district and you're making district level decisions and you're trying to beef up the content knowledge of your educators and help them reach more students and ensure access and equity for every learner, then this might be an opportunity for you to dive into as a school or a district. So reach out to us on the makemathmoments.com/proportion site, and we'd be happy to get on a call with you. All right, John, let's dive into our conversation with Tom. Hey there, Tom. Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. How are you doing today? It's actually pretty early today. How are things in your world?
Doing well. I think the earliness for you guys is a little bit different from me. So 7 o'clock is about 3 or 4 hours into my day normally. So
wow. And you got to be on East Coast time if that's true too, because that is early stuff. Tom, you know what? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Fill us in on some details. Where are you coming from? How long have you been teaching? And maybe what's your current role in teaching?
Yeah, so I'm about 14 years into teaching. I started as a in-school suspension teacher, instructor, before picking up one period of math later that year at the middle school level. And then I continued there for 4 years doing math and language arts in a 7th grade inner city school, and then transitioned over to one of the top districts in the state of Ohio, where I again did 7th grade language arts and math, and then moved on to a high school where I taught business courses. I taught personal finance, introduction to business, entrepreneurship, and a few classes like that before picking up and sliding over to algebra at the high school level for 3 years. And now I'm finally in my current role as a sixth grade math teacher at Olentangy Orange High School, which is about 15 minutes north of Columbus, Ohio. So, and that's where I'm currently at. I'm a sixth grade math teacher and a high school baseball coach.
Love it. Love it. And close to Columbus, that is not too far from us. 4 hours down I-75, I think, from Detroit. We're just across the border. So awesome stuff. And listening to your 14-year vet experience going from in-school suspension to some math, and now you've got the middle school math, you were in the high school. Like, I've got to assume that all of those experiences are really helpful, maybe difficult at the time. People always say, especially newer teachers, as they sort of get flopped around into different roles, it's got to make you so much stronger as you go. You know what, Tom? I'm really curious, with all of that experience going even further back, one of the questions that we love asking our guests is a math moment that you remember from your educational journey. Do you mind sharing with the Math Moment Maker audience?
Yeah, I'd say one that sticks out for me. I transitioned I went to a private school up until fourth grade. And when I was going into fifth grade year, I transitioned to a public school near my house. And the content, the curriculum worked a little bit quicker, I felt like, at the private school. So we were a little bit ahead. So when I went into the fifth grade classroom at the public school, I felt like I had already seen a lot of the material. I don't think I fully understood the material, but I've seen it before. So my ability to quickly complete work, whether it was in class or homework or things along those lines, it made it seem like I was really intelligent in the math class, and I would ask for more work. And I feel like that's what I received. I felt like I received more work as opposed to enriching activities or extension problems or real world application projects. And so I think I felt like I was really strong in math, but I wasn't getting stronger. And now looking back at it, I don't even think I was strong in math. I think I was able to regurgitate information or concepts that I'd seen in the previous year.
Interesting. And that's so common in our schools today, is that if a student is ahead, or the teacher thinks the student is ahead or is kind of, say, more advanced, the object is like, let's just give them more to do. And I think we're definitely doing a disservice there. It sounds like you had that moment that's kind of ingrained into you. I'm curious, Tom, how do you think that moment has then helped shape the way you've become a teacher? Like, do you use that when students are more gifted than others or quicker at certain ideas and concepts? Are you remembering that when you're in class with those kids, or how is that shaping your decision making in the classroom?
Right now, I teach 4 core classes. So I have 4 different sections, and some of them are somewhat ability grouped. And so we absolutely have some stronger students in certain sections. What I try to get out of those students is just their ability to share and attack and approach problems differently. And I think through dialogue and allowing them to share out and things along those lines, and then having them explain errors that they see in other students' works, I think the dialogue and the conversations that happen in the math class now, as opposed to just working on problems, allow students to stretch their thinking, to see things from different perspectives. That's kind of my approach to it. So when I find out a student's very, very strong, I try to get them to be able to explain it, to be able to connect it to whether it's previous lessons or future lessons. And I think by teaching algebra at the high school level, I kind of see where they're headed in their math, I guess I'd say their math career, and try to say and stretch them that way. But the conversations that happen in class and getting students to be able to articulate their thinking and to be able to really share out why they go about a problem a certain way, I think that's huge for me, as opposed to just answering more problems.
Yeah, I love that. And you really had me reflecting as well, because I know even along my journey teaching, when I've had students that were asking for more work, I love how you put that. That's exactly what you got, was more work. And I'm sure there's so many people listening who might take a pause right now and sort of reflect on their own practice. I think we often are really focusing in on trying to help students who might not be at grade level, let's say, or maybe they have some gaps, or there's things that we want to do, and we really focus on differentiating for those students. But I think sometimes those students who are ready for something a little bit more, a little bit deeper, oftentimes they get put kind of as the last thing to think about, right? And what do? We just hand them additional problems. And I even think about just how much more impactful. I remember in one particular class helping a student by basically giving them some knowledge type questions from the next grade level, rather than now thinking about it. I'm like, why didn't I actually look at my current grade level and look for some really challenging problems? Less is so much more. If I could give one really solid problem to that student, and maybe it's a problem that I never used because it just wasn't developmentally appropriate for the rest of the class. You've taught me something and had me reflecting here today. So I love that. It's like you've got some success there with getting students talking in your class and getting them working together. I'm wondering, why don't we dive right in? I'm wondering if you have any challenges or struggles, or like what we like to call a pebble in your shoe, which I like to quote from Jim Strachan, a good friend of mine and mentor of mine, that pebble in your shoe. What can we dig into here with you today?
I would say that the most difficult thing I find is, so we've been big with Desmos and using notice and wonder and trying to get kids to see things from different perspectives. And so in sixth grade math at our school, I would say fractions and decimals are always challenging. And I think they're challenging because of the way that we present them initially. So we may present it as, we'll say 25 hundredths or 0.25, and we don't see it as a quarter or as money or a quarter of a game or whatever the situation may be. My biggest thing has been lately, I've been trying to get away from the procedural algorithms and things, but then sometimes with the struggling students, they'll go home and especially we're on hybrid now, so they might go to school on Monday and be off Tuesday and Wednesday. And so they're working, we'll say independently or with a tutor or a parent at home who says, well, the way you get this answer is I learned keep, change, flip, whether it's with fractions. And I'm trying to explain to them the why behind it and trying to give them other ways to approach the problem. And I think because I won't say all parents, but some parents feel like the success is in getting the correct answer. And they say, well, you'll get the correct answer always if you do it this way. It'll get you the right answer. But I keep trying to explain to them, I don't know if I've ever used keep, change, flip or move these decimal points in order to do long division, because if I need to do that to do well on an assessment, then I'm probably just going to end up using a calculator when I get older anyways. And so I'm trying to get them to see it's not about answer getting, it's about problem solving. And that's been my biggest struggle, is just trying to get them past the point of people who say, oh, it's that new math. It's new math. No, it's the way that when you're sitting in class and somebody goes, how does that kid get the answer so quick every single time? It's because their approach to the problem is different and probably a little bit more efficient. And it's not that they're way more intelligent. They're just more efficient problem solvers. So I guess trying to get them into the new math, the quote unquote, what people are saying is new math.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this is common when we're dealing with students who are going home and talking to parents, and parents are understanding the way they've done math and they're showing them techniques and strategies without thinking them through. It's a constant, I think, battle that we all have. And I think I understand your frustration, your challenge with trying to get students to see the underlying concepts of what you're working with in your classroom. I'm wondering if you could fill us in on some details to give us a better picture of what you've tried so far. So I'm hearing you're struggling with getting them to understand that, but what are you doing to combat that now? And then what is it about that you're doing that you just don't think you're having success?
I'm okay with state assessments, and everybody says, standardized test and things along those. We don't teach to a test or anything along those lines, but I'm okay with any challenge that's thrown at the students, whether it's a standardized test or not, because I think what we've done, at least what I've tried to do and what I've grown to do in my classes, is to develop problem solvers. And so, for instance, we'll present a problem or a situation where I know that there are several ways to go about a problem, but some are more efficient than others. And so we'll kind of talk through it. So just a situation may be a basic your traditional textbook order of operations problem and think about like a situation where it's a long expression with that ends with a fraction bar divided by, we'll say 25 hundredths or 0.25, and just present that problem and try to get students to talk about, okay, where would this problem ever come into play? Where would I ever see or have to attempt to solve something like this? And then we talk about different strategies. So I think traditionally, if you take that problem home and somebody sees who's using, again, we'll just say quote unquote old school math, they would say, okay, well, it's dividing by 0.25. So we're going to move this decimal 2 spots. We're going to move the decimal up top 2 spots, and then we're going to divide. So then when we come back and talk in a whole group situation, we'll talk about, okay, how did you approach this problem and what were your strategies? And I think as students start to talk, maybe some of your students who are a little bit more, I'll say, they're able to work with numbers a little bit more fluently. They may say, okay, well, you're dividing by a fourth, or you could think about how many fourths are inside of 20 or something along those lines when they get there, and a kid will say, wow, that's really good. And so I think what I try to do is get them in situations where there's several ways to solve a problem, and that when they come back, the conversation starts to go and kids can start to ask questions. But again, you got to create that space in your classroom where kids feel comfortable saying, well, why would you do it that way? Or I disagree. I tried this way, and kind of get that conversation going. So I think that's how I've tried to do, is just to present problems that have multiple ways to solve it. And what I would say is potentially more efficient ways, not better ways, but just more efficient ways, and try to get the conversation started in the class.
You're saying a lot of great things. Like even early in the conversation, you referenced the idea of getting students talking, and there was opportunity there for students to share their thinking. I'm hearing this mathematical discourse idea coming up again, where you're having students come in and reason and prove. These are all such important parts of math class. And actually, too, I also jotted down, I thought it was great how you mentioned, like, you look at a standardized test as just like another challenge. And I tend to be on the same side of the fence. I don't think we should be completely worried about them. But at the same time, I look at it as it's a great opportunity when you have somebody else writing an assessment for students to work through, because then there's no bias there, right? When I write my own assessments or create my own assessments, there's some unconscious bias there. Like, I'm teaching to my own test. Like, the way I teach is the way I'm going to test. And you can probably have a big debate about that, about some of the pros and cons there. But a lot of what you're saying really sounds fantastic. And I hear this word efficiency coming up quite a bit. And there's a bit of a worry about the rush to the algorithm. And for those who have been a part of our webinars or have listened to the podcast, you know that we talk about that a lot. We are concerned about those things as well. So I feel like we're all kind of in one big happy family here, talking about some of our concerns about sort of rushing. And I also heard this idea of how parents sometimes can even influence that rush, right? Hey, just do it this way. This is easier. There's that new math stuff again, right? So there's all of these challenges, but I want to dive a little bit deeper here. And I'm wondering, because I'm sensing a bit of a challenge between the idea of trying to help students get to this understanding of what is efficiency in math class and what does it mean to you? Because again, there are so many different varieties and flavors and perspectives on what does it mean to be efficient in math class. And then there's this algorithm piece where some people look at the algorithm is the efficient way. And clearly I'm hearing that you don't believe that's necessarily where we want to rush students to. So I'm wondering, can you unpack that for us a little bit? What is efficient to you? And how do you help try to notice and name it when it's happening in your classroom? Now, these are big questions and it's early in the morning, so I apologize for that in advance. But I think it's worth us kind of diving in here a little bit, just so we can kind of get a little more clear on what that means to you and how we can help shape that.
I have 3 kids, and my daughter's currently in 3rd grade. And she brought home a math assignment the other day, and I was so excited because the approach that the teacher was taking in terms of teaching subtraction. And I share a lot of these stories with my 6th graders because I think they were taught borrowing and always borrowing, right? And So I talked to them. I said, actually, one of my co-teachers who's in the room with me during the class said, you got to be careful because I often hear you saying this is not a good way. And I try to apologize for that to my students at times because if they need to borrow and cross out and things along those lines, I don't mean to say it's a bad approach, but I want them to think of different opportunities. So, for instance, she came home with a problem, and I'm making this problem up. We'll just say 67 minus 49. And I asked her, I said, how do you get there? Like, what are you going to do? And I showed it to my sixth graders, and I would say the overwhelming majority, borrowed, crossed out, and brought it over and those things. And so I talked to my daughter, and she said, we're only allowed to count by ones and tens, and we've got to get there. And I like that approach. So I think a lot of what I try to do with the students is say, okay, how do you do this and why do you do it? And then we start to go from there and talk about, okay, well, what if you thought about it this way? What about counting up? Because I think when you borrow or you do long division, to me, if it's things that you can think about differently without writing every single thing out, I know a lot of people say, show your work, show your work. But I like to say, share your thoughts, as opposed to show your work, show your work. So I've been working really hard on trying to get students to see different ways to do it and to be able to explain those ways. So, but at the higher levels, at seventh grade and eighth grade, I think sometimes the teachers come down to me and they say, your student struggles to show their work on this particular problem. And I can't give them full credit because I can't see what they're doing. And I think that's where the feedback and the conversations have to happen. But so to get back to your question, how I'm approaching it is just, I think at the younger levels, the teachers are doing a really good job. And I just want to make sure that our sixth graders are seeing that the borrowing and the long division, I keep saying the keep, change, flip, all those methods, they don't need to be totally thrown out the window. The algorithms don't need to be thrown out the window. I almost want kids to write their own algorithms, write their own formulas. Like, I think that's the coolest. Like, remove the question. I don't know if it was Dan Meyer, who it was, that talked about, in a textbook, give the context, the story context, but remove the question completely and let the kids discover what the question's asking or what question they think would go with that particular problem.
Just discussing this is starting to emerge some things that you can see to address this struggle. When we first started this conversation, you wanted kids to see different strategies but you wanted them to not rush to that algorithm. But then I heard you just say you wanted kids to build towards the algorithm or an algorithm that they've created. And I think we would totally agree with that. Like, we want to put kids in situations, like I like how you described that you're going to give kids questions that have natural different strategies to get there. And the idea here, right, is that we want kids to build this fluency, but also create like efficient strategies to get there. And we want them to kind of like catch those strategies. Christina Tonneval talks about catching strategies. And also Kathy Fosno and Pam Harris, we've heard them, we've learned a lot from them. They're like, we want to emerge strategies. And I think it is about building towards an efficiency, but I think that efficiency comes from where that student is at that time. It sounds like you're on that path and you're working towards doing that. And I think that's great. So I guess I'm wondering, because I think we got some tips here. I think you're on the great path, but I'm wondering, like, what do you think is not working with what you're doing? Because you're saying lots of great stuff here, Tom.
The thing I worry about is, am I going too much to the mental math side of things? Am I chasing too much of I think every student should can and absolutely can think about math differently. I guess I would relate it to, and I talked about being a baseball coach before, we often talk about like a zoo tiger and a jungle tiger. Are you familiar with that metaphor, I guess you would say?
Remind us and all of our listeners about what we're referring to.
So what it is in a training environment, there's skill acquisition and then there's skill application, right? And so when you're trying to acquire a new skill, you're more so like a zoo tiger that's taken care of, you feed the zoo tiger, they're safe, there's not a lot of struggle, versus a jungle tiger who now the environment has changed and they have to utilize their skills for survival. So it's a lot more productive struggle. It's not as safe of a space, but the struggle is amped up but also if they're trained correctly, they're able to grow through that struggle. And so it's two different training environments. And I can almost think of a classroom as being a training environment. So when you're first acquiring a skill, you're kind of helped through that a little bit. But at some point, you have to release the experience to the student and tell them to just let it rip. And you're going to have mistakes and you're going to struggle through things, but through conversation and feedback and continually talking through things. So I think sometimes I push kids into that jungle tiger mode quickly. But I think if you've created your classroom the right way and there's trust and they understand that, listen, a grade's never permanent. A grade is just where you are. It's a snapshot of where you currently are and that we can grow through this, but you got to be okay with the struggle piece of it. But I think I have to do a better job of gauging the temperature of the room and making sure that every student is ready for that jungle before just sending them on their way, because I think some get worried and I definitely don't want shutdown mode. So it's just, especially in the times that we are now, I always talk about active participation, and it doesn't always mean, speaking in class, but it's the eye contact, the body language, and the facial expressions. Well, the facial expressions are out the window with the masks. So I've lost that piece of, your formative assessment of just trying to read the room. That's my biggest struggle, I think, right now is when you have a group of students and just I'm trying to push to thinking differently. And if there's not a true love for learning or a true love for math, I've got to find a way to get it there, because you can't be exposed to the jungle if you don't have an interest or a curiosity, I guess.
I think we're very similar in that thinking that we like to create sort of that jungle environment, we'll call it. I've never used that analogy, but I think I'm going to hang on to it. So thanks for that there, Tom. But something that we've talked a lot about as well is this idea of trying to build that culture. And the word that comes to mind throughout this conversation is trying to, and I always have to remind myself of this. So, this is not a judgment by any means, but I'm the type of person as well. Like I'm a kind of go big or go home type person. That's my personality. Like I like to be all in or all out. And the part that's challenging about that is that sometimes I lose sight and I lose track of the balance piece. And it can be really hard because I want all students to achieve at high levels in my math class. I'll call it plan hard. I plan for the jungle. I want to make sure that every lesson is going to be a good experience and I want everyone to enjoy it as well, not just get the math piece out of it. I want it to actually be something that people are enjoying along the way. And sometimes if I lose sight of that balance piece, that could be really tough. And thinking about the culture of my classroom and what am I saying and what am I doing in my classroom? We talk about that a lot as well, as this idea of sometimes I say one thing and what I do sort of suggests another. So am I articulating what I value through both what I say and what I do in my math class? And are students sort of getting that? Are they getting that message? And it sounds to me like you're giving a lot of open problems, and these are a few assumptions. I'm wondering, like, what does a typical lesson look like? Can you give us sort of like, in this scenario, when you're saying this is sort of my challenge that I'm bringing kids to the jungle, like, what does it look like when you enter the jungle? Like when you get into class and let's say it's a newer concept. So if it is, you gave the example of grade 3 and borrowing and subtraction, that sort of thing. Like what would it look like in your grade 6 class if you're entering into a new idea? You mentioned fractions earlier. Maybe it's around fractions, operating with fractions or something along those lines. How does that look and sound for us, just to make sure that we're getting a sense of what that math lesson looks like? And then we'll try to start hashing some ideas on maybe some thoughts and steps that we might take to move forward.
Yeah, so last year I made the argument that in sixth grade math, based on our curriculum, the majority of problems can be looked at with ratios, proportions, and tables. So I try to make a lot of connections to tables. So they have that skill. I know that they have that skill. That was one thing that I wanted to make sure they can see relationships between numbers within tables. So with that in mind, the majority of our units will start with what I'll call a hook or a story. And when I talk to you about getting up early, a lot of my preparation and things for class start through, in all honesty, it's listening to this podcast and hearing some other ideas from other teachers. And that starts in the morning. And then I just start to think through things, and I'm reading and some people say I'm addicted to Twitter, but I read on Twitter or I'll catch something. I'm like, okay, that connects to the lesson. So a lot of my lessons start with a video, a picture, or a story. And so I've had people in the past say, can we get guided notes for our student, whether it's an intervention specialist may ask for guided notes. I don't know what the notes look like until we start to go because they take over the class. So if you think about I'll present a story or a situation or a video, and I've gotten pretty good at Desmos, so I'll usually put it in there with a notice and wonder and just let them start to talk through that and just start to say what they notice about it, what kind of problems they think they can link to it, what kind of math concepts. That's how the day usually starts. If it's not a Desmos and it's a situation with a smartboard where I'll just present a problem, we'll talk through a situation, I'll tell them it could be made up or fabricated in some way, shape, or form to kind of get us to the concept, but I'll always start that way. So just to get them thinking about a situation. And that's every day. So that's every day starts either, like I said, a picture, a video, or a story. And then we start to get into the concept. And then if we branch off into terms, sometimes we'll talk about terms, and that's where my language arts background comes. We'll talk about root words and kind of things along those lines just to kind of tie it all together. But as far as like the lesson ending, we don't have homework. Like when I say traditional homework, it's not go home and do 10 to 12 problems on this. To me, the best homework is when a student leaves the class and continues to think about it. Like, man, I wonder about this or that. And they start to think about it in their own life. That's normally our homework. And then they come back the next day and say, did anybody make any connections with what we talked about yesterday? But the normal lesson, like I said, starts with a video, a picture, or a story. And that's how we jump into every single question, every single problem.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing lots of good stuff to encourage discussion in your classroom for sure. And I think we kind of articulated, Tom, that most kids in my class, in my grade 9 class, when I teach grade 9, when I think about this, I've got lots of kids who have come in with lots of different background knowledge, and especially algorithms or procedures, just different ways that they've learned things through their parents or through their classrooms from different elementary schools, different classes. And what I notice what my kids want to do is they want to get done the fastest, right? It's like all of a sudden, like before the culture has changed in my room, before, especially this is early on in the course, kids will view math as a let's get done kind of subject. And they naturally will try to do the math the fastest they can get it done so that they can move on to get the next thing done. It's like math for some reason is a get done type subject instead of a exploration, discovery, naturally kind of just absorb or learn. Like the quality of learning is not like most kids don't view math as that subject. They just want to get it over with. And especially if we're like, these are the questions to do, then it's definitely like the faster I get them done, then the more free time I have. I find that my students do that. And therefore, they're going to try to naturally progress through to the fastest solution. Like, how do they get that done as quickly as they can? And I have to take a lot of time to kind of change mindsets with how we view mathematics. It's a lot of discussions about not getting done subjects, about what I'm valuing, like actually saying out loud that I value the strategies that you're coming up with. I want to see those strategies so that I can help you connect ideas together. And if you're using this standard algorithm in this particular way, then I want to show you or help you see how another student's strategy who's done differently is connecting to the strategy. I guess this is a long way of saying, Thomas, I don't think the algorithms themselves, especially when I get to grade 9 or maybe 7 or 8, is necessarily bad, right? Like I think they're developed with a purpose, but I think we need to make sure that kids understand the underlying concepts of them. If I feel comfortable in my classroom that a student understands or has demonstrated that they do understand how the algorithm is connected to, say, a double number line or an area model or other ways, ratio tables. If I feel like that comfort level is there with their understanding, then I'm completely fine with them using, say, an algorithm. I don't have to say, hey, go back and show me the table, because I feel comfortable that if I did say that, then they could show me that, right? Like, I think we want to make sure like knowing our students where they are in their thinking is so important. And I think that can be helpful in saying, okay, I'm okay with the algorithm over here. this student might not be at the algorithm stage yet because they're still moving into that progression, but also might be like, hey, I ran to the algorithm, but they didn't show these other techniques. And it's like, and I think when I do that with students or try to get them to see the underlying concepts, it's continually modeling. You as a teacher, I as a teacher, continually model how that looks in a different way, like an area model or a number line. And then those strategies will kind of get connected to the students, because I think we want to move kids along so that, yes, they can process things a little bit faster, but also see those underlying concepts. So I don't think the algorithms themselves are bad. I think it's just like knowing where our kids are in their journey. I'm going to stop talking and see what you think about that and any comments you have about kind of thinking that way.
Yeah, I think I've said it probably incorrectly or probably should have worded it differently in terms of the algorithms, because I often feel that if you're using a standard algorithm, a lot of times a computer or calculator does that for you now. And so if you use a traditional and write out a traditional algorithm, are you going to ever do that outside of school? Where I feel like the skills that we're trying to teach are things that you can utilize outside of school. And that's my whole worry is, yeah, the algorithms are great for passing an assessment or getting an answer on a regular, multiplication problem. But how can we think about it differently? Because if we take the time, like we're doing unit rates, and I talked to the students about, the algorithm would be to move, I don't know if this is considered, the method or the procedure would be to move the decimal and then divide. And I try to talk to them about different strategies. If we were at a store and you're going to pull out a piece of paper and move the decimals and divide, at that point, you're probably using your phone and a calculator. And so, not that the algorithms are wrong, but more so, I want to give them something that they can utilize going forward. And so, where parents or tutors or people who say this is the new math, I would ask them, how often do you use borrowing in your real life? In your real life, are you still using it, or did it work really well to get you to pass that sixth grade assessment 10, 15, 20 years ago? Because I want to give you something that you're going to use day in and day out.
And something too I'm hearing as well, Tom, I'm picturing how often people try, and I say this is like mostly adults, I'm going to argue, when they're trying to do what we'll say, quote unquote, is mental math. It's like they're just doing algorithms in their mind. And for many adults, some will just sort of give up, just like some students, right? Where they're like, I can't hold all of that information in my head. And oftentimes it's because we call it, it's like we strip the problem down, right? We make it a naked problem. So you're in the real world, there's context, which is so helpful for us to use mental math strategies. And we've been taught or sort of promoted throughout our own education to strip down the problem, grab these naked numbers, do some stuff to it, and then come bring it back and try to make it make sense in the context again. And I'm hearing that from you, and I completely agree. I don't want to teach two algorithms. But one thing that I'm starting to realize myself is that one of the challenges we have is there's like two kind of groups of students in our classroom when it comes to procedures and algorithms and concepts. And I'm going to argue that there's the group of students that are ready to have strategies and models and big ideas emerge. So we'll call them, they're like new to a concept, or they haven't memorized an algorithm yet. It's like those are the students that are, to me, is so fun to work with, because it's like you can help these things emerge. But then you've got this huge group in our class where either at home or in a previous grade level, they've been shown these algorithms that they've been told, and they now trust these algorithms work, but they don't necessarily understand why they work. And I kind of picture you standing in the middle of these two groups. And the challenge is, and this is only an interpretation based on this very, very short conversation, but the challenge is I feel like you're like, I really want to emerge these ideas over here with this group, that they're ready to slowly let it emerge. But then it's like the rest of the group over here has these strategies, and it's almost like polluting the minds of these other students, right? Saying, well, like if you just move this over here, or if you just change and flip, that's going to work. And then the other students are like, okay, I'm just going to blindly follow. And it's like you're stuck in this sort of game. And I feel like one of your maybe at least next steps could be something that I hear you're already doing, but I don't know if you're realizing that you're doing it. And I wonder if maybe just a little more intentionality around this idea might help. But you're talking about having students have conversations. There's math discourse. There's so many things going on here. And what I'm wondering is, first of all, to us, calculators, let's push them away. I used to have calculators all the time. Kids were using calculators, and calculators oftentimes sort of promote this idea of speed, as efficiency is speed. And what I realize now is, like, if I want these ideas, these strategies, big ideas and models to emerge in my math class, I want to be intentional about the quantities that I'm using, so that they lend themselves to students modeling it mathematically and using strategies without calculators. And then the second thing is, when students do come with the move the decimal or the change and flip, or flip and change, and all of these different cross multiplying, whatever it is that they're using, the one thing that I feel like could help you get to this next place is, rather than us sort of like trying to demote the use of an algorithm, I love playing the play dumb role. As the educator, it doesn't matter which side of the room I'm dealing with, students who are emerging strategies and models, or students who are already coming with a algorithm they trust and they believe will work. I have the same response for both sides, which is, wow, that's really interesting. How does it work? I have no idea whether I should believe you or not. And sometimes I wonder if us just sort of playing like we don't know this algorithm actually works is a means to get students to, maybe they're going to keep using it. Like, it's going to be hard for them to break the habit, right? They've got this habit that they've been using this thing. They trust that it works. They have no idea why it works. And my goal for them is that conceptually, I don't know if you actually understand why this works. And for me, mathematical proficiency, just like as they've outlined it in the Adding It Up document, comes down to those 5 strands of math proficiency. And 2 of them, one of them is conceptual understanding. The other is procedural understanding. There's adaptive reasoning, strategic competence, and there's productive disposition. All 5 of those things are what kind of go together. Those 5 strands are what make mathematical proficiency. And I am a true believer that if a student comes with an algorithm and they can spit out answers, I'm like, that's great. You have some procedural fluency. I would even argue they don't even have complete procedural fluency, because they define procedural fluency as like a true fluency, like they understand how it works and they can get themselves out of tough spots using these procedures. And I would argue memorizing it, that doesn't actually mean that they've got a complete check mark in that column. So when I'm picturing this, like I've got this picture of Tom standing in the middle of the room, and you've got kind of like 2 different groups like these. And of course, they're all at different places along this continuum. But you have students who are like fresh out. They're like eating up your open-ended problems and trying to emerge strategies and models. But then this other side, they're like, I already got the answer. And I guess my wonder to you is like, can I respond in the same way to both groups and say, wow, that's fascinating. I don't know why this works, or how do I trust that what you're saying is true, or any of those sort of things to kind of nudge them along so that they have to go back to the drawing board and go, you know what, Mr. Marker, I don't think he's just going to accept 28 as the answer. Like, he's not going to just say like, that's good. When students come to me with the algorithm, oftentimes they'll say things like, is this right? Right? I'm sure there's teachers at home nodding their head like, is this right? And I used to say, yep. Or I would say, oh, you're on the right track, right? Like they know right away. It's like, yep, I'm right. Okay, I'm done. Or, oh, you're on the right. Oh, I made a mistake and I have to go back and do it. Now my response is always the same thing is, I don't know. Is it? And if you just say, I don't know, is it, to those algorithm friends, they have to go back and go, well, yeah, like I borrowed right, or I changed and flipped. I did all of these things. But at the end of the day, if they come back to you and you say, is it right? And they say, yes, it's right. I say, well, how come? And they say, well, I changed and I flipped. You say, well, I'm not very good with that type of thing. I always say to kids, like, I don't know, I'm not very strong with like formulas and stuff. I need to see it. Like, so help me see it. And that could be maybe like a step in the right direction. It won't change it immediately, but I'm going to flip it back to you and sort of get your perspective. Like, are you seeing yourself in that room with these two groups of students, or am I completely off base on that? I'm really curious to get your perspective on it.
It's dead on. And I love the approach that you take with that. I think the one thing I try to do too is, as far as like, I don't know, is can you put context to it? Because I think you guys talked about, and I don't remember the podcast number, but you talked about reasonableness of answers. And that's, I think, one of your standards or something along those lines, where students have to be able to make sure that their answers are reasonable. And I think, like you said, I don't know, is it right? I would more so say, is it reasonable? But they have to have context. They have to give the problem context. And so I love the idea of explaining the algorithm or explaining the method. We have a method that we've been using for a couple of years that I kind of got upset and frustrated with this year in terms of least common multiple and greatest common factor. And I don't know if you're familiar with like a birthday cake method, but it was really frustrating to me because the problem may say, this bell rings every 4 seconds and this thing happens every 12 seconds. When will they occur again? The kids kept getting the answer, and I couldn't explain why a birthday cake method worked for the answer. It was frustrating me. I couldn't. And so they would say, well, should I use birthday cake method here? And I'm like, I have no idea what you should do here. Here's how I would approach it. How would you approach it? And they're like, well, I want to know whether I should use birthday cake method. And I'm like, gosh, one, we're calling it birthday cake method, which is embarrassing to start with, right? And secondly, like, I don't even know why this thing works perfectly. It does. And so that's my big struggle too. I know if they say, well, I'll just give it a shot and try birthday cake method and get it right. And I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know where to go with that because the student's struggling. They got the right answer, but they have no idea. Should I correct them? Should we talk more through it? There's some things that we've done in the past, right or wrong. I think you can continue to evolve and develop and reflect. And gosh, I don't know if I'll ever use birthday cake method again for anything because it's so frustrating to me that one, the name, it just makes me cringe a little bit, and then the idea of why it works. So
yeah, and there's that perfect opportunity to say, like, what is that? Explain it to me. Like, why is that working? Tom, this has been a great conversation. I'm wondering at this time, like, how are you feeling right now about the call? Like, I'm thinking, like, what do you think, a big takeaway from our conversation here has been today? And also, like, what is going to be your next step?
I love the part about probing and just saying, never answer is it right with yes or no. Like, to me, I like the idea of, well, explain to me why you justify why you believe it's correct, or why are you even asking the question? What makes you nervous about why it could be wrong? I've listened to every podcast, every one that you guys have, and there's so many different takeaways, people's different perspectives, people's different approaches, right or wrong. And I just think of it as a big professional development opportunity for me in listening to the podcast. So hopefully just talking with you guys and hearing your approaches to things that I've kind of been nervous about. I just think I need to get better at, I think you mentioned it just on the podcast that was released this week about asking the right question and being able to make sure you're asking the right questions to get the students to not only think, but to reflect and to evolve. So I think that's some of the notes that I've taken, is just the importance of how you ask a question and how you answer their questions as well.
I love it. And it is something as well. Like, I know with John and I, especially doing this podcast, and I'm in a role in my district where I get the opportunity to learn with educators. So we've done a lot of reading on coaching. And oftentimes, if you pick up a good coaching book, and we always talk about the Coaching Habit as a book that has really influenced how we do things as math coaches, but I would argue it also has influenced how we interact with our students as well. So if you think about some of that technique that we described with our students, it's like in that book, a key thing that I try to use it in life, just in general, is this idea of stay curious a little bit longer and hold off on advice giving just a little bit longer. And I love how open that line is, because even in this scenario, it's like, even though I want to say to a student, using the algorithm when you really don't understand what the heck you're doing is not going to be helpful for you in the long run. Like, that's what I want to say, but how that's interpreted or whether that actually has any valuable impact on the student is probably pretty low. Like the chances that that's going to work is pretty low. So it's like, if I can ask a question, that's this curiosity part that he says. It's like, stay a little curious, just a little bit longer. It's like, if I can ask students those questions, maybe I can help nudge them along this journey without them necessarily realizing that I wasn't a huge fan of the algorithm. So again, it seems like just small little tweaks that you can try just to see how they work with students and see where they go. Now, you said grade 6, you talked earlier about how so many problems can be solved through ratios, proportions, and tables. And we tend to agree, like middle school concepts. And then even here in Ontario, like into grade 9, like proportional relationships is such a big and such an important concept. But I would argue it's like one of the muddiest areas of mathematics. There's so many people who know how to solve proportion problems, but the understanding of ratio, the understanding of what is a rate, how do we reveal rates, like where do they come from, and all of the journey leading up is really muddy. So for you taking the time joining us here today on the podcast, we're going to be hooking you up with a seat in the Concept Holding Your Students Back, which is a full course on unpacking key concepts in proportional relationships. Now, we're not suggesting that you aren't doing a great job with that, but we did want to give you something that might help push your thinking as well and give you some tasks that we go through throughout the course. It's a 9-module course and usually done over 12 weeks, but we'll give you all the time you need there. And we'll just give that to you because I'm really curious to see whether there's anything in there that helps you along this method, because we'll take like full lessons and we'll kind of unpack how we'll approach them and some of the questioning that we might have for students along the way, noting that we know that some students are going to try to resort to an algorithm. And something I think is really important too, as being that Mr. Marker standing in the middle of these students who have some students over here who are emerging strategies and models because they're like kind of fresh coming into this concept. Then you have these students over here who know the algorithms. And the hard part for me as the educator is I need to be able to notice and name where students are. John mentioned this earlier, where they are in their journey. And I have to help try to connect them. Because only when a student on one side of the spectrum and the other side of the spectrum, only once they see that what they're doing is actually the same stuff in disguise, that is something that I think is so helpful for us, especially for someone like yourself who's in this scenario where you feel like it's almost like two completely competing priorities in a classroom based on where students are coming from. And we would argue that if we can help connect those ideas in our consolidation, that will help both sides of the room sort of value, oh yeah, like that student's approaching it this way, and I can see that idea in my solution. We do a lot of that inside of that course. So we're going to give that to you. We'll email you all the details after the fact. But my friend, we want to thank you for hanging out with us. In the show notes, for those who are listening, we're going to have a ton of links. For example, I heard about multiples. So we're going to add hourglass multiples, which is a great task on multiples. You talked about fractions earlier. We're going to add the woolly worm race, which is a complete unit of study for folks to access. So lots of good stuff that are going to be in the notes. But at this point, I'm wondering, Tom, is it okay if we get in touch with you, let's say like 9 to 12 months down the road, to see how things are progressing on your end, to see how this journey you're on is coming along?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love that. I'd love that.
Awesome stuff, Tom. We want to thank you for joining us here on the podcast, and we're looking forward to seeing you in that course, The Concept Holding Your Students Back, and we'll talk soon.
As always, both John and I learned so much from these Math Mentoring Moment episodes. It's really great to be able to not only hear what educators are struggling with, but it reminds us of those same struggles that we experience when we're in the classroom. And it really gives us an opportunity to dive deeper and think and reflect on ways that we can overcome these challenges to ensure we reach every learner in the classroom.
Yeah, and a great way to hold yourself accountable is to write it down, or even better, share with someone, or your partner or colleague, what you have learned. Maybe you head on over to the Make Math Moments community area and tag us at Make Math Moments in our free private Facebook group, or hit us up on Twitter.
Awesome. And John, People, we don't go and just randomly email people to join us for these episodes. We need to hear from you. Like, what are you grappling with? A lot of times people think like what they're grappling with is sort of unique to them. But in reality, there are so many struggles out there that so many other people are thinking about and struggling with. So why not apply over at makemathmoments.com/mentor. You just add in a couple sentences basically on what it is that you're kind of grappling with, and we will get in touch with you to discuss a time and date that we can hop on for a Math Mentoring Moment episode.
In order to ensure you don't miss out on new episodes as they come out each Monday morning, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
Show notes, links to resources, and complete transcripts to read from the web or download and take with you. You can grab them over at makemathmoments.com/episode 129. Again, that's makemathmoments.com/episode 129. Well, Math Moment Maker friends, until next time, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high five for you.